Yeah, we're live. It's 6:53. I want to be a little early today to make up for the other days when I'm not here on time. Sometimes it happens. You got stuff running around, and all of a sudden you realize, hey, I got to do my live feed. I got to go talk to my boys. What's up? And girls, Liv, if you're here. I don't know too many others that are here, but she's awesome when she comes on. Tonight we're going to talk about overcarburation and as it's related to your choice actually of turbos too. So I'll show you how those things are related. But first of all, let's get into a discussion about overcarburation. And this is actually more common than you think. I don't think, maybe not as much for guys that are on the street because they've chosen to live by this this carb calculation that they use for displacement. So that's very common, been around for years. And maybe that's helped people kind of err toward the smaller side for the carburetors, which is a good idea. And that's kind of what I'm recommending here. But we'll discuss why. And we'll discuss also why a lot of times people won't do that, especially after going to the dyno. Because we show them time and time again, if for instance, a small block Ford or a small block Chevy runs really good with a 650 carburetor or a 454 from the wrecking yard, which I get this all the time. We run a stock 454 and I put a 650 carburetor on. It's a motor that makes 370 horsepower or less if it's a Gen 5. And I put a 650 on it and just people just lose it. You can't run a 650 on a big block. It's a big block. It needs a big block man-sized carburetor. Yes, but it still only makes 370 horsepower. And what carburetor would you use on a 370 horsepower motor? Same thing with the Buick, the 455. That motor made less than that, 300 horsepower. Well, what kind of carburetor would you put on a 300 horsepower motor? Oh, but them Buicks and the Cadillacs, they like them big carburetors. Well, they can get away with bigger carburetors because they're bigger, because even though they only make that amount of power, they make a lot more low-speed power. And so they will have, better response and stuff. And they can get away with a bigger carburetor, but they don't need an 800 or 850 making that amount of power because they're not flowing anywhere near that amount of air. But we're not going down that tangent. But here's what happens when we run stuff on the dyno. And I think that this is what tends to make people think that I need the bigger carburetor, or that I really, it's more a matter of that I want the bigger carburetor. Here's what happens. So we'll run let's a small block Ford, could be an LS, could be a small block Chevy, Dodge, whatever. We'll run that motor on the dyno. We'll run it. It makes 400 horsepower and then we ran a 650 XP Holly on it, which flows way more than enough to support that power level. We'll go up to a 750. Let's say that this happened. I'm not telling you it always happens, but let's say that it did happen. And let's say we made 8 or 9 more horsepower with the bigger carburetor. And we'll assume a lot of things in this description. We'll assume that the carburetors were the same model and stuff. So we're not talking about, a circuitry change that maybe is a change in distribution or change in droplet size or change in, just fuel metering and stuff. And then let's say we have the same air fuel and stuff. We're just, the bigger carburetor maybe flowed a little bit more air. Maybe it allowed us to make more power at the peak, let's say. And so this is not unusual. It's not unusual for us to, on a hopped up motor like a big block, we run an 850 on it, we put a 950 on it, it makes more power. We put a Dominator on it, usually it makes even more power. A lot of times more because the Dominator intake manifold is better. We saw that a lot on the LS3 stuff, that when it went from an 881 or 4150 carburetor to the 4500, when we went to the other manifold that accepted that 4500, it's better. And yes, also it was better when I tested it with the HP series or the XP series, where we could run a 4150 on a 4500 flange. It's still better with the bigger carburetor. And I think not just because that carburetor is better, I just think that having the thing separated is better, having them closer to the port, having a better signal. I think there's things that are going on there that are irrespective of something that you could say that carburetor is just better. But I digress. Here's the problem when this happens, and it does happen. The bigger carburetor makes more power. But on the dyno, we're only running, let's say we even ran it to 2,000 RPM. Let's say we ran it from 2,000 to 6,500. That's a pretty big spread, but sometimes we can do that. We can do that more often on a bigger motor than we can on a smaller motor if we wanted to do that. The average power production on the big block makes it a little bit the dyno is a little more receptive to that than a big spread in power, a big change in power. But if we made more, let's say that we made 10 more with some carburetor change, that's going to obviously, for all of us, me included, and if you're doing it with a customer or somebody that's putting this motor in a car, he sees that and goes, oh, look, you went from this carburetor to a bigger carburetor and it made more power. Yes, that's not the whole story. You don't drive around at wide open throttle. In most of the curve, they were the same or very comparable, and you're talking about 1 or 2 horsepower or whatever. Usually only at the very top did it make more power, you know, at the peak where the thing is most wanting the airflow and where the carburetor could provide more airflow and therefore make more power. But the problem is we've shown him the genie now. The genie's out of the bottle. So he's seen the power. So he's going to want that power. He's not going to want the less power because nobody's going to choose that. No matter how much we try to tell him, look, the smaller carburetor is going to be better and might also be quicker at the drag strip and will certainly be more fun on the street and will probably win more races on the street if you're doing that than the bigger carburetor will. Because not very often do you win on the big end. It's almost always won if you do any drag racing. You know the race is usually over, you know, in the first 100 feet or so, because whoever gets the lead, whoever has a better reaction time, whoever car responds well, whoever has the circuitry done on their carburetor, the transition circuitry, so you can get the thing to not, you know, to lean bog or misfire or to be really fat at the beginning. If you can get all of that right and get the thing to leave and then get it so it's making the power curves that we saw, if you can get both carburetors to do that identically, then the one that makes the most power will win the race. The problem is that that's usually not the case. It's usually not the case when we go to the bigger carburetor that it has that. It has extra power and it has all of the other things. That's not normally what happens. What happens is that when you tip in is less responsive, and there are obviously things that we can do to adjust that. We can adjust that with, you know, power valve and squirter and the cam and, you know, all of that stuff. But there's only so much you can do after you get to all of the adjustments, all the possible adjustments on it. It really is just a function of how big that is and how responsive the fuel is and how much you can get that. And that's the motor and the camshaft and the carburetor size, and it eventually becomes that. And so unless the bigger carburetor was ideally sized and the smaller one was too small, which is not normally the case, the smaller carburetor is almost always a better choice for any kind of street and or street strip stuff. If you are running a dedicated drag race car and you have this thing up on a converter or on a two-step and you're running from 5,000 to 7,000 or whatever, and you're only taking advantage of what that extra power had to offer from the bigger carburetor, you should pick the bigger carburetor. Most street strip cars, most daily driver kinds of cars, or even dual purpose cars are not that, especially not carbureted ones. They're not that because you can't have usually all of that, especially, you know, as you start leaning more toward the, it depends on where you are on the spectrum. If you start leaning more toward the race end of the spectrum and you have a higher stall speed and stuff, there's more chances that you could take advantage of that. If your car is primarily street and it's tailored more toward that you also take to the track, then, and if it's a daily driver and any kind of just street car and not race car, then we almost always recommend the smaller carburetor, because the reality is that even if that bigger carburetor was a tenth or a half a tenth and a mile an hour, a half a mile an hour faster and quicker, even if it did that, that's how much time do you spend doing that versus how much time do you spend being able to enjoy all of the other things that the smaller carburetor does for you on the street. And this is also true of other things. One of the things I mentioned in the thumbnail is in the description is turbos. And we get this a lot with turbos too, especially we all know, and we've talked about this many times, is that if we put a smaller turbo on, it limits how much power we can make. So we got our 700 horsepower turbo, we have our 1,000 horsepower turbo. Once you show them that, hey, this 700 horsepower turbo is falling over and it's not really that happy in this combination, and we put a 1,000 horsepower turbo on, especially on the engine dyno, we got an artificial load, and if it's sized okay, then we can get relatively decent boost response on an artificial load engine dyno, and then everyone's going to want the bigger turbo because it makes a lot more power. But the reality is, again, like with this bigger carburetor or a bigger camshaft is another example, you're going to like the smaller turbo. 90% of the people are going to like the smaller turbo better on the street because there's more stuff that's beneficial in what I call the fun zone. That's where you're rolling into it and you want the response. You spend a lot more time doing that, going up through the gears, or one gear or two gear pulls, than you do trying to get, ET in mile an hour. Again, if that's your thing, if you've got a stall converter on an automatic or a two-step and you have it geared properly and you're running it out to the RPM and power range where you want, there are certain things that a 700 horsepower turbo will do. It's not the same as what a 1,000 horsepower turbo will do. And if you're in a position where you want to take advantage of what that extra 300 horsepower has to give, maybe you want another 2 seconds or whatever off your ET and add another 15 or 20 miles an hour, then that's what you should have. But that won't be as fun. And this is especially true on the turbo side. This is especially true of a smaller motor and the bigger turbo. So if you've got a 454 and you're choosing between those two turbos, there's really no choice. You just pick the bigger turbo because you're going to have almost the good response, but you'll have a lot more power potential and you won't have lots of back pressure. But if you're doing a 4.8 and you want to do it with a 1,000 horsepower turbo, you got some decisions to make, because then the lagginess is definitely going to be there. The camshaft that you pick for that kind of combination is going to be critical. The intake manifold that you pick for that kind of, the torque converter that you pick, all of those things will come into play and decide kind of your enjoyment of that combination. Just like with the bigger carburetor and the smaller carburetor. The bigger carburetor might indeed make more power, but will it give you the thing that we all want most? I don't put combinations together so that I can show somebody. This is going to sound weird. As a personal thing, I don't put engines together so I can show somebody a dyno sheet. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I can test things and show you guys the dyno sheets. But I don't go on to forums or get together with my buddies and brag about how much power I make and post my dyno results so that they can see how cool I am. Those two things don't go together for me. I'm much happier telling stories about the success that we had. Like, for instance, the Bonneville motor is a good example. The Bonneville 2-liter or sub 2-liter motor that I did, the Honda B series deal, we could have made a lot of power. We did, in fact, make a lot of power in the engine dyno. We made over 700, but it never ran anywhere near that. I mean, that was at 29 pounds. We only ran it at 17 pounds. But, why didn't you turn it up? Because we didn't need to do what we set out to do. What we set out to do was not run the thing at 2 bar. The thing that we set out to do was actually just to set the record and go fast and do it so that after we set the record, the car was still drivable, the motor's in one piece, we could load it back up on the trailer, and we still had a complete combination. And we did, and that's what happens when you set multiple goals for the thing. Not, I want to make as much power as possible. That's silly, unless you're trying to break a world record for the most powerful Jeep engine or the most powerful B series or whatever it is. Then by all means, set your sights high and do the thing that you got to do if that's what you're doing. But in our discussion, the talk about how much you're going to use what the smaller carburetor does for you versus the bigger carburetor is going to give you bragging rights. If you're okay with those bragging rights just being a piece of paper and a dyno sheet. The other way, the smaller carburetor is not going to give you, I lost 10 horsepower or whatever, 8 horsepower, whatever it is. But it's so much fun. just just tell them it's a 400 plus horsepower small block and take them for a ride in it, and it probably will scare them. So, again, I don't do that stuff for egos. I do it for enjoyment. And so having putting the Vortec on my Mustang, I loved having that thing on there. Right up until I rode in one that had a turbo. I'm like, oh man, it's so much different. It doesn't have a rising boost curve. It has like, oh, there's all the boost, and now we're going to carry that all the way out. It's a whole different thing. And so, learning new things obviously is always good, which is what we try to do on the dyno all the time. But again, and this is the true of camshafts, and I see this a lot because I get, as you might imagine, I get a lot of notifications from Facebook and stuff where people have referenced either videos that I've done or stories or tests or whatever, and we still get this common thing. Yeah, I'm putting together a 4.8 or 5.3. I'm going to use a stage 2 cam. I'm going to use a 78, 75. And what intake should I use? And guys are like, look, this is already all done. It's been done 10 years ago. Go look at this video and pick the intake manifold. And then I always try to chime in, like they're asking what camshaft should I use? Should I use VTR or LJMS or sloppy or whatever? I'm like, look, I don't care about which one of those names that you attribute to it, but pick a small cam because the turbo that you're using will do everything that it needs to do with a small cam, and you'll get all the enjoyment on this side. So the carburation thing is exactly the same deal. And this is especially the case if you're, I think even more so, if you're on the carbureted application, if you've saddled your 6,000 RPM small block with a single plane intake manifold. Now having the small carburetor is not just better, it's almost a necessity. On a dual plane, you can get away with more because you have better carb signal, and you could always put, if you wanted to, use the smaller carburetor, put a spacer under there, pick up a little more power on the top. If it's an open spacer on a divided intake manifold, usually what we do is pick up a little power on the top, lose a little bit down low, power brake it a little bit harder off the line and get going, and make sure you're going to have to tune it as well. You're going to have to change the jetting in it. You're going to have to add jets to it because it's going to be, the signal's going to be worse. It's not going to be drawing as much fuel. You're going to need bigger jets if you do that kind of thing on a carbureted application. But again, the smaller carburetor, especially on a single plane, probably a much better idea. You might be able to get away more with the bigger carburetor on a dual plane. But even on that, a dual plane and a responsive carburetor, or like I said, if you want to go to the track, put your spacer under it. I would drive around for most of the time while I was driving without the spacer, because the spacer, even if it adds more power on top, like the bigger carburetor, is not going to win you races. But not having it, having the response of the dual plane and the carburetor right over that dual plane is probably going to win you races, because it's it's going to be on the lead that all this stuff happens. So remember, pick a smaller carburetor, pick a smaller camshaft, and pick a smaller turbo, and you will be much, much happier. So let's see what you guys got going on today. Okay, get some water. Fresh cold beverage. This one right here is a pellet gun, yes. Do you have a build sheet for a 451 with a procharger street friendly? Yeah, James, take a look at the videos that I have up. There's a whole playlist of big block blower nitrous turbo section that has a playlist for those big blocks. And I did a 496 that was really good with a procharger on it. I ran a procharger on, if you want to look at 454 stuff, I ran a procharger on a 454 crate engine from GM, which I think, and we may have put a camshaft in it, but that's also a good option. And it's easy to make fairly big power numbers with a big block and boost. What about a 351 Windsor 220cc Cleveland 2V head? Single plane Holly Dominator road racing. I don't know about the, is a standard Cleveland 2V head 220 cc's? Back at the lighthouse. So let's see, I'll scroll down. I was going back to see. Big block Chevys, yep, that's all good. Speed density is a sensor that changes with elevation. Does it have a barrel sensor on it? I would think that if you want to be really picky, you would flow test flowing the carb bolted to the intake and hit. And what is that going to show you? That's actually not going to show you response rate. 1150 on a stock 4.8. Well, if you notice, the photo that I put up for the thumbnail was a 1050 Dominator on a 292 inline 6-cylinder. Not only was it on a otherwise stock 292 inline 6-cylinder, but it was also bolted on with, I don't know, 6 or 8 different adapters, going from the 1-barrel opening that they have in that intake manifold to a 2-barrel, and then to a 4-barrel, and then from the 4150 4-barrel up to the 4500, and then I put that carburetor on top of it, and I ran it, and it ran on the dyno, showing that you could just get wildly large-sized carburetors to work. Although you wouldn't want to run that, although it'd be cool when you pop the hood to have a Dominator on there, you wouldn't want to run that obviously on the street. Would CFM be more relevant to horsepower engine size? I look at it in terms of horsepower, because the carburetor needs to feed the airflow required to make the horsepower. You can have wildly different 454 big block Chevys. You can have a big block Chevy that makes like a Gen 5, a stock Gen 5 peanut port motor makes like 370, like 310 or something. So that's a 300 horsepower big block. That same 454 could make easily double that. And so which carburetor would you pick? You wouldn't base it on the displacement, because that's not going to be a good combination. I would pick a smaller carburetor for the milder combination than I definitely would for the bigger carburetor, for the more powerful combination, because you would be holding it back. I would pick a 650 for the 310 horsepower one, and I certainly wouldn't pick that for a 600 or 700 horsepower version. What do I do to increase the power of my 89 Cadillac Alante? I would do, you could do all the things that everybody else does. You could do headers, exhaust, air intake. You could do tuning on it. You could port the heads. You could have cams done. Boost would be an option. Keyboard warriors, I like a tri-power setup where you can cruise on the center carb, and then yeah, it's a good theoretical system. How do you feel about the Edelbrock ProFlow 4 EFI kit? I don't know specifically which one you're talking about, because I don't know which engine family it is, and they seem to apply these names to a bunch of different things. To me, when I think ProFlow, I think the tunnel ram style intake manifold that I ran in the, I think we ran them in both the Cathedral port and LS intake test. So I don't know exactly which one you're talking about. A K24 swap in place of your Cadillac motor. The K24 is a Honda twin cam 4-valve deal. Swapped out an 800 Edelbrock for a 950 double pumper. Your 496 feels like 30 horsepower. I don't have the ability to judge that. The LS of the import world. That's true, Oliver. That's probably pretty close. Yes, the Liv Holly carbs work pretty well. VTEC is with Mad Torque, yeah. They all accomplish the same goal. I'm just considering if a carb works more like a speed density concept or mass error concept. Is it pressure differential or just mass flow? Steve Brule likes to think of the carburetor as a mechanical mass error meter. 352, the 2-barrel on my 67 F250Y. So the shop fridge stays full of beer. So you're keeping it stocked so that you can spend your money elsewhere. Don, I don't so he was saying on flow testing, maybe use a small carb that doesn't restrict the flow. I don't think that that's going to give you the right size carburetor. I think that that's going to give you the bigger carburetor. Wouldn't the 4V head affect runner length potentially versus a 2V head, even though they have the same length? It's not gonna, if they have the same length, it can't affect runner length. We didn't miss the poll because I don't have one yet. Okay, this is going to be an off-topic poll, going for 100%. So which one is it? I think that this is a PA. I don't know if it's PA or. Okay, the poll for today is, should I do a big bang on a Barra, an NA Barra BABF motor, the early low dollar versions, I guess. Because when everybody does a Barra motor and they build them up on the engine dyno or even on the chassis dyno when they run them in cars, all these YouTube things where they make it 1 million horsepower, they almost always start out with the turbo versions, and smartly so. But that they made it a lot more, I'm pretty sure, NA versions, and I have a couple of those, and they've been talking to me because I just let them sit for a long time about doing it. So the question is, should I do a big bang on one of these NA Barra motors? And obviously we're not going to do an NA big bang. We're going to do a boosted big bang to see how much these, small rod NA versions with higher compression, so they're going to make more power, what they'll do under boost. So should I do a big bang on the Barra? Yes, mechanical mass air meter. That's Brulé and his infinite wisdom. Is 14.7 air fuel really ideal for cruise? No, it's not. You can get much better fuel mileage if you run it leaner than that, as long as you keep it out of misfire. Preference between a 4L80 versus a 6L90. I don't know about those two, especially in that application, in a towing application. Somebody else might be able to help you out. Have you ever run the Chevy 194 head on a 250 and a 292? I haven't. I haven't done any mixing matching of those 6-cylinders. I remember when I had a 67 Pontiac Firebird that had overhead cam 6-cylinder and ran a 750 vacuum secondary with a 4-speed stock. Nice. I don't have any procharger kits. I think Liv has one of those overhead cam Pontiacs. I think it's damaged, but I would like to run one of those. Liv, if you're listening. Link, I've seen the lawnmower carb thing, but it's the lawnmower carb is not really what's doing the fuel mileage thing. Coolest thing we ever did was a 4.8 liter big bang. That was very exciting. You guys should have been there, because Ernie, the guy that was doing the tuning at the time at Westech, that worked at Westech, his wife is fantastic, and she's a fiery piece of work, and she was giving us a hard time. Well, giving me a hard time. Come on, don't be a sissy. Turn the boost up. It was pretty awesome. want to run an 830 Holly on my 468 build. Will it be a good choice? Yeah, that's the right kind of size, as long as it's making good power. Yeah, Liv, let me know. Even if it's not, you know, hopefully we don't have to weld the crank up, but if we have to turn it and put bearings on it, whatever, I would like to run one of those and just get it running and do something with it. We need to debate the virtues of the double pumper carburetor. Why do we need to debate that? There are people who don't want to see a bear big bang. As I told you, this should have been a slam dunk. This should easily have been a home run, like 100%. And yet there are people that are just that. I mean, there always are. You see the news is full of them, of people that don't really understand what's going on and don't care and only want things their way, and people that will purposely do it just to instigate stuff. That's why they have the word troll. What did you make on the 4.8 Big Bang? The first Big Bang, we went over 1,200 with two 76 millimeter CX racing turbos and kind of a hodgepodge setup of stuff. And we didn't break it then. We didn't break it till later on when we tried to run it. What broke it was actually we put it on a second time, and then we were going to try to make more power, and we were starting the load earlier or later in the RPM range, so we would run a shorter sweep basically. But a stationary load at like 900 foot-pounds, it didn't run like that, because it liked like 400 foot-pounds and then release it and then have it come up, and then it comes up on the turbo and does its happy thing. It's fine doing that. And on the early ones, I didn't do on the 4.8 and the 5.3, I didn't do ice water in the intercoolers, which I should have, and also used those CX Racing turbos, especially on the 5.3 that made over 1,300. We were probably getting up, I think, near the limit of those turbos. And then when we, good things happened when we put those two S475s on there. I want to scroll back here and see. No, I didn't see it. The lawnmower thing is cool. I mean, obviously, I'm sure he's going to get 1 million views on it just because the idea is really cool. Why did Bud more run a manifold, 2 Dominators on a Boss 302 with each Venturi feeding each cylinder? Well, if you look at, and that's a really good example of that, but also if you look at a stack injection, like the Crowler stuff or Kinsler or those things on the Can-Am cars, or really on any kind of motor, on any kind of small block, you have each individual port. Some of these things can flow 300, 400, 500 CFM, which was getting up to the size of a single carburetor. But then you have 8 of them, so that's more than enough flow. So, but yet they like that. It would be great to see you put an adapter to put 2 DCOEs or IDA Webers on a 4150 flange and swap it at different choke sizes to see how power is affected. They B&M used to have that adapter that they bolted onto the 4150 that went into 2 side drafts. In my opinion, 2 side drafts isn't enough to feed a motor, not a V8 like that. And I think that those make less power than a good size carburetor does. But honestly, I've never tested them. I'm just going by what people had told me. I think it probably would be better if you had a tunnel ram and then you had 4 of those on there. But it would. I've run DCOEs as side drafts on Z stuff, but we put 3 of them on a fairly mild 6-cylinder. Richard, I'm late to the party, but if always been able to run out of motor before I run out of carbs with two 650s on a dual quad, or have I? Again, it depends. We've run bigger carburetors even on tunnel rams, and sometimes they make more power. But that would be another extreme example where the bigger or the smaller carburetors probably would be better. Although I don't know how I don't know how drivable people with dual quad tunnel rams think that they are, or actually try to get them to be. Turbo Winnebago with a stock trans in it. That's pretty impressive. The rings were gapped on the 4.8. The rings were gapped on all of the big bang motors. I'd like to see you do a test on a small block whatever. Start with a 750 Hive and use a 750 Edelbrock and see what the difference is. The problem with 750 Edelbrocks is that we need to get a bunch of stuff to tune it. My new shop truck is a Godzilla 4 with a 10-speed. The old 6-liter 6L80 combo gets better mileage. If only there was a carb with small primaries and huge secondaries, like a Q-Jet or something. It tows a car hauler with a turbo 6-liter Winnebago. That's super cool. That's amazing. And that's a testament to tuning, I think, as much as anything. Liv, I'm sure I'll hit the junkyard on my next trip to West Tech. Are you looking for something? Can you put a centrifugal blower on a diesel motor? Yes. How much more air charge cooling does a carb provide over EFI? None if you use a throttle body EFI, or very little difference. Quite a bit if you're talking about port injection. Two 50-millimeter DCOE Weber side drafts with 46-millimeter vents with low enough of 350. I don't know what size carburetors they had on those adapters. Richard, you need to get a bunch of stuff to tune a 750 Edelbrock. We don't have any whatever that thing requires. Is it metering rods or what is it? I've never even tuned one. Should boot all the people who voted no. Where are we at? Really, 14% don't want to see that. 83 votes. We got a lot of people here. We got 120 something people here. You guys need to get out and rock the vote, man. Big Bang Bear, what do you guys think? Get the votes up. Actually, get a lot of votes, I would think. Come on. Meteor rod springs, idle main. Yeah, see that I don't know that West Tech doesn't do a lot of tuning on Edelbrock carburetors. I think Steve tries to avoid those. Bill, the power from a DI motor can come from all that. Usually it comes from an increase in static compression because they don't have to worry so much about detonation because they've got a lot more, so they put a lot more static compression in it because you don't inject the fuel in and give it a chance to detonate beforehand. That works very well. Most of the DI motors have, like if you look at an LT motor, they have really good cylinder heads. They make good power. And it's also more than that, because I know when Brian did a test on, I can't remember if it's an L83 or an LT1, but they did a test and converted it to port injection, and it still made more power with the DI, which surprised me given the charge cooling effect of port injection. Kilowatt carbs work fine. I prefer Ollie, maybe because I know them better. And it might be that one is more of a, like, this has kind of been the thing with quadrojets, and I know that all the quadrojet fans are going to yell at me, but the originally, early on, the quadrojet was a really good street carburetor, and that the Holly was considered the performance carburetor, the one that you put on, you know, if you're going to the track. I know that times have changed a lot, and there's lots of stock eliminator guys or pure stock or whatever they're running, guys with quadrojets making 1 million horsepower and going 6s or 4s or 2s or whatever they're running. I get all of that. But traditionally, that's been the way that people have looked at them. I think 14% want to see build the bearer naturally aspirated. You would do the same things. I mean, I've seen some of these naturally aspirated deals. Guys normally put headers on them. I haven't seen a lot of guys changing the intake manifolds on the naturally aspirated stuff. But you could do, you know, a long tube header. You could do a short runner intake. You could do cams. You could do ported heads, or ported head, and that should make fairly decent power. But it's just never going to be what even a very low boost turbo thing is going to be. Thermoquad. I had a thermoquad on my 360 and I loved it. It worked great. It drove nice. I don't think it's ideal for making lots of power. Yeah, Cameron Wood, there is something to be said for customer service. And even if you have a superior product, if you don't back that up with good customer service when people call and they have concerns or questions or complaints, then you know what happens is you look at our 14%. The people that are unhappy, look at our country. The people that are unhappy, they're, even though they're in the vast minority, they're going to be wildly the most vocal. So the guy that gets online and complains about the carburetor, you're not going to get all the hundreds or thousands of people or whatever where they put it on and work perfectly. They may say that to their buddies or whatever. So yeah, it worked great. But they're not going to get online usually and tell everybody how fantastic it was. But the guy that tried to put it on, and even if it was his problem, maybe if he had a vacuum leak, you know, he stripped a bolt or whatever he did, even if he did something wrong and somebody wasn't there, customer service wasn't there to help walk him through making it right, he's the guy that's going to be vocal. So customer service is a critical element, and it often can make a customer service and availability can make a product that maybe is not quite as good be a lot more desirable for people. Because even if somebody says, oh, look, I want to get this head or this carburetor or this intake manifold, well, they don't have it in stock, and even if they did, they don't ever talk to anybody. Well, I'm just going to buy this other one, even though I know it's 5%, you know, more expensive, or that it doesn't make quite as much power, but it's close. I'm going to get that one because it's there, and those guys are there, and they stand behind it, and we like that. Are you ever going to do another nitrous Big Bang? I want to. I think that would be cool. I would like to make 1,000 horsepower with a nitrous Big Bang motor. Where are the tubes from the old office? What tubes? Have you seen Holly's tour video of their carburetor manufacturing facility? I've been there. I've actually been back there and got a tour when they were doing that, but I haven't watched the video. I'll have to check that out. The Elbrock ABS2 works good. I have a bunch of high-performance quadrojet parts I'll donate. I like quadrojets. I've run a couple of them on and tuned a few of them on when I was doing some of the I think that the L46 had a quadrojet on it, if I remember right. And the L82 maybe, a couple of the small blocks, and sometimes we'll run factory Q-jet intake manifolds with Q-jets, and And usually we get them from Sean Murphy Inductions, because he has a bunch that we know will just bolt right on and work. But they work really well. And when I did the stuff with the Cadco back there with Courtney, he walked me through the changes to the Cadillac specific Quadrajet, which was very, very cool. It actually has the ability to sense changes in altitude, which I thought was, and it was very, very cool the way that they did it. But we know that you can get them to work, and we know that they can make power. And I do like the fact that they're really small in the primary and bigger on the secondary, which could help you get better mileage. I know guys that have locked off the secondary because they didn't trust themselves, so they disconnected it or put a stop on it so that they can only use the primaries. So they're trying to race around when they're trying to race around, they can't stop themselves under just the primary, so they wouldn't use all their fuel. This was way back, but also with a Q-Jet, you get that air cleaner flip lid air cleaner kind of, whoa, you get that noise, and the other carburetors don't do that. Some guy with a large channel about engineering filmed the video in collaboration with Holly. Oh, okay, yeah, Liv, let me know what it is. Of an AED 750 double pumper that seems to pump gas down my engine no matter what. Take a look at gaskets on that, or take a look at your fuel level also. You had huge long tubes, cardboard tubes, maybe 4 or 5 inches diameter, 5 to 6 feet. Tubes, man, what's in the tubes? Were they back in a quarter or something? The only cardboard tubes that I can remember that I had is I have backdrops. They're photo backdrops. You've seen them in some of the videos, especially the early ones. I used to hang them up at West Tech. They were given to my wife actually by a person that lives next door to her family, to her parents. And he had a photo studio, and he had these, and he was just going to throw them away. So she's like, "What are they?" They're these they're painted canvas rolled backdrops. And she's like, "No, we want those." And so I've been using a couple of them for a long time, and I think that's what they were, but they're probably in the garage or something now. But I really like them. And I've used them, like I said, I had them hanging up. I had to make a wooden stand and stuff so that we could hang them up. And I used them for a lot of videos so I could stand up there and do my Richard talking to the camera thing. Big cam plus big Holly plus standard trans equals stall or stoplight. You just need to get the idle speed up. It just needs to have 1,000 RPM idle speed. I ran a 750 on a Atari 305 that ran better than a 600. That would be very unusual, and it would be those two carburetors specifically in the way that you had them tuned, not as a universal thing. $132 people and 2 likes. That's not very many. On fuel economy cam question. Yeah, it's 98 thumbs up now. 97. Oh, does somebody unthumbed up it? They unthumbed me, man. That's rude. Especially when I'm looking. If I'm not looking, it's okay. You can do that. Toyota's air assist system has a vacuum reference air plenum surrounding each injector. The idea being it helps atomize the injector spray. I would think that a diesel injector spray, and I think that that's what you guys are talking about, that diesel injector spray, given the pressure that comes out of a diesel injector, I wouldn't think atomization would be a problem. You have a 1271 blower. Is this too big or unusable on a 408 stroker? Lower rotor speed equals high leakage. I don't think that that's the case. It more depends on what is your desired power output. If you want to be 600 horsepower, that's not a good blower for that. I mean, it'll look, you know, impressive because it'll be gigantic, but you don't need that blower for that. If you want to make 1,000 horsepower, then that's getting to be a better blower. Use the tubes next time. The tubes are part of the show now. So you just want me to set them back there, set back cardboard tubes? I got more stuff to do in here that's going to be make it much better. Ran a 950 on a 349 small block Ford, and I loved it. It ran great. Again, that's at the track they'll do that. And a 950, we run 950 is really the go-to carburetor at Westech. That's normally the carburetor that we put on almost everything, even small motors. I have to talk myself out of not using that. Liv, the Holly 3-barrel. You know, somebody was asking me about those the other day, and I don't know if I don't think I've ever tested one. And I don't know if Westech has one of those carburetors, although the owner, he might have one because he has lots of the OG stuff. Did you do that GM inline 6-liter? I haven't. I did some testing on the Atlas already, but I have more coming. I'm late to the party, but I want to point out venturi size versus base plate size has a lot to do with how the carb flows. Yeah, and it's not just carb flow. It's the way that it fuels. So the boosters have a lot to do with that. And, you know, there's a lot of adjustability in a carburetor if you really get down and start getting after it. Bug catcher, barn door, toilet. You can find 3-barrel Hollies at swap meets. Is that still a thing? I mean, oh, so Liv, somebody's donating a 3-barrel to you. Is it those were 900s or 950s, right? Yeah, I think it was a 950. One of the problems with quadrajets, I think, is the amount of fuel in the bowl. I don't think it has a lot of it doesn't have the same amount of fuel flow, right? Not flow, but it doesn't have the same amount of fuel storage, let's say. Want to use a side draft carb setup on a small block? What do you think about side drafts? I like side drafts, and the way to do a side draft, there are really two ways. One way is to use a cross ram manifold and put side drafts on it, which is just nothing but awesome. The other way is, like we were talking about, they made an adapter that went up and came out and put side drafts on. That is more of a show thing to me, and will do nothing to performance. It would, I think, only be able to equal what a 4-barrel does, and I would honestly be surprised if it did that. Not because side draft carburetors don't work, obviously they do, but because of what it has to go through, it's still limited by having a 90-degree turn and then going into a conventional intake manifold. But side drafts on inline motors or on a rotary or a big Weber on a Mini Cooper engine, that's all cool stuff. Could someone answer a question for me? Would a piston that weighs 10 more grams than all the others be a problem? So you have one that's 10 out of balance. Why don't you just drill a hole in the bottom of it and take the 10 grams out? I run a 44mm big bore Harley Carb with a KO3. So is it a draw through? Because that's kind of cool. What's the CFM of a LS truck or an LS1? I don't know what the intake manifolds flow. I think somebody has done that test, but for me, that's not an intake manifold. The flow rate of the intake manifold is not what dictates the power potential of the intake. That's more runner length. The runner has to be sized to flow enough, but you could have two intake manifolds that flow identical, or even one that flows less than the other, and it will still make more power. And that's because of reflected waves and stuff. Yeah, it's got a big that the carburetor that Liv's talking about has a big oval, like an oval throttle body kind of. The big cube engine will suck a quadrajet dry. Even a big horsepower small block will too. I've seen a 283. Yeah, the amount of fuel that it has in reserve is not ideal, and that's one thing that I was surprised about with when I ran the L84 327, the 375 horse 327. We ran it with the fuel unit, which was cool, and the guy was there to do all the tuning on the fuel injection, which is fairly simple once he, like everything else, once he explains it to you, once he tells you all the things that it does. But the thing that I was surprised with it is it had one needle in seat, and it had a fairly small fuel bowl, basically. And so I could see why people would have problems with that, because we did on the dyno, and I had to stand in there and make sure that it was the needle and seat were open and the thing was like max flow into the fuel bowl. So I could see why that might have been problematic back in the day. You're still going to put 2-barrel carbs on a crossbar? I would like to. I don't have one of those intakes yet. I wouldn't know what to do with a carburetor. Where you plug in the USB cord? Well, what you do with a quadrajet and the USB cord is you wrap the USB cord around your neck, and then you tie it to both sides of the carburetor, and then you just wear it. And you could be like quadrajet Flav. 78 millimeter versus 202 millimeter throttle bodies on the same intake. The problem that you have with that, it won't do anything to performance unless the 202 millimeter throttle body flows a little bit more and the motor needs that more airflow. Here's the problem with that, is that unless you make an adapter to neck the 202 down to whatever size the intake is, or if the intake has a 202 millimeter opening, and then you neck that down with the 78, it all comes down to the intake manifold is going to dictate what that power is. The only way the throttle body can add or subtract from that, it normally can't add to that. The only way it could subtract from that is if it becomes a restriction. Does the 78 millimeter throttle body flow enough to support the horsepower of the airflow needs of the rest of the motor? Does it do that? Normally, I just say match the throttle body to the opening in the intake manifold. In this case, you got a lot of porting to do to match a 202 millimeter throttle body to a 78 millimeter opening. I think you're going to port all the way to outside air on that one. Somebody makes a manifold for 4 DCOE carburetors. Yeah, if you're talking about for most engines, they have them for LSs and they have them for small block Chevys. I have a video up with downdrafts on the small block, and they have them for Fords. Shelby ran them on the Cobras and stuff, and on FEs, and then also for cross rams. So we run cross rams with those as well. $10 grams on one thing is a lot. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But you could, if you drill it, you could take out, I'm sure you could take out 4 or 5 anyway. Quadrajets on a 455 Olds. Yep. I think I had one of those on the one that I had. I can't remember. The Holly 3-barrel came in 2 versions, 950 and 1030. They were based on Carter trapdoor carburetors that Pontiac used in NASCAR. Were banned immediately. Only 13 of those carburetors were made. Please share tips on selecting the correct power valve on a double pumper, big cam with a very tight LSA. The story is I bought a set to redo an LS. I injured one and could not find just one, so I bought another set. Really don't want to pull the other 7 again when I can just put one on. Charles, do you have very low or no idle vacuum? All right, Liv, we'll see you, man. Let me know about the inline 6-cylinder though. You could use the AC as a fuel cooler. Anything where you have a transfer medium that's lower temperature than the thing you're trying to cool, it will obviously work. So let's take a look at it. I'm really surprised by this. Should I do a big bang Barra? We're going to close this out at 82% saying yes with 135 votes and 18% saying no. We have more people than that watching, which I'm surprised we didn't have more votes on it, but that's interesting. So we'll stop our poll there. So you didn't feel comfortable drilling down into the bottom of the piston? Just milling it a skosh, you know, it's only a couple of grams. Be fine. It's not going to take away any power. It's just going to add balance. Inner chilling. The AC cools the liquid and air to water intercooler. Yeah. People are talking about that a lot. I still think that that's an awful lot of work. 360 FE has a 2-barrel stock. What 4-barrel would it need? Is if the motor is all stock, then you can either put an Edelbrock intake manifold, which they make for the FE, and just putting an aluminum intake on there would be huge, because not only would you pick up power going from a 2-barrel to a 4-barrel, which you definitely will, and that's going to be 25 or 30 horsepower probably on that motor, but you'd also get a lot less weight because the weight of an FE intake manifold is ridiculous. And so putting an aluminum version would definitely be better, and then put a 650 on a stock one would be more than enough. Yep, Flavor Flav Carb. That's trademark. 327 aluminum heads, nostalgia, 3030 cam, 4-speed. Oh, 529 gear, just all the gear. The 3030 cam is going to kind of limit 327. I don't know what heads you have in that, and what intake manifold do you have in that. I'm leaning towards a 750 on that. And if it's a drag race only car, I might also be convinced to put an 850 on there. The thing that's holding it back is that camshaft. A 4150 series Carb has an 1 3/4 throttle blade. I never made anything larger, so how do you get 950 CFM with an 850 base plate? I know EFI, I'm carb handy. I like the ease of EFI with proper software. You can change it without touching a wrench, but I like the Carb for simplicity. It is nice to just sit in the other room and do jet changes with EFI. A blow-through carbureted application or throttle body, if you have that, would also can also offer charge cooling. Charles, what power valve is in there right now? Do you know what the number is? Edelbrock TM1. Oh, the Tarantula. That is OG. I'm thinking 750 is what I would try on that. B gas nostalgia class. One more minute. Since it's 7:50 now. Oh, it just clicked over to 8. Man, I just nailed that. Everything sounds great. 8,000 RPM. That's true. I'm kind of excited. If the Barra thing works out and we run that, we'll have that and the Slant 6 and the 292 Chevy and the 4200. What else? And an L28 there, and there's just no end. And if Liv comes through, the Sprint motor, that's a lot of 6-cylinder stuff. Well, Charles, is going to want the power valve to come in earlier if it's if it's a lean problem. And with enough work, guys can make lots of different carburetors run good. You'll get guys that when you talk about carburetors, you'll get Holley guys and Quadrijet guys and Edelbrock guys and Thermoquad guys and whatever. And they'll all have examples where they did something, or their buddy or their cousin or their second cousin did something and made it work great. And you can. And a perfect example of that is Engine Master. It's not that they're using Thermoquads, but so many different kinds of combinations. Oh, Ford's the best way to go. Chevy's the best way to go. Cadillac's the best way to go. Whatever is the best way to go. A 312Y block, Kazi. Although that was fairly far removed from an original one, but still, it shows that you could, with the right amount of knowledge and attention and dedication, that you can make these things work, and a lot of these guys can do this. And so that's kind of a cool thing. That's a cool thing about the hot rodding industry, is there's not just one way to do that. There's not just one carburetor that's better than everything else, not just one. And again, you guys get to have all of your favorites, and you should, but your favorite doesn't mean that that's not some other guy's favorite. D-Sauce, happy to help, man. There's always lots of good guys here. Z, the carbs are clearly the best. I'll tell you the thing I'm excited about doing is, and then I got to get going, is I want to run that Oliver's L28, and I want to run. I talked to him about running the early 240-260 intake manifolds, and then doing the Crown turbo kit with a draw-through turbo, or with a draw-through carburetor deal, and running one of the SUs or one of the trash can carburetors. I think Zenith did those. But that will just be interesting. It's not what I would recommend if a guy wanted to make power. It's not what I would recommend if a guy wanted to turbocharge one of these motors. Even if he wanted to do a draw through, that's probably not the combination that I would recommend putting together. But it's something that was available back in the day. and it's cool. And I want to do other draw through stuff just because, again, not ideal distribution. I don't know what that's going to be like given the way that they designed this intake manifold. And I use intake manifold, you know, with a heavy heart, because it's just a tube, and it's just not even a straight tube. It's a bent tube with two other tubes coming off of it at a 90-degree flange. It's just something that they connected the turbo to these things to. A Y would have been a lot better, and but they couldn't, because the exit of the turbo was almost past where the connection for the manifold was, and they should have used a different, you know, they could have done it a lot better. But it works. A single draw through carburetor blowing into that manifold, non-intercooled, obviously it was a draw through, and yet it's still, you know, life finds a way. Yeah, foreign. I searched YouTube and I didn't see that kind of stuff. I didn't see the testing that I wanted on the 2.2 or 2.5 liter turbo, the Dodge turbo motor, the Omni turbo stuff. I just, like I said, it's just frustrating to go there and not see, okay, then we started out and we ran it stock and it did this at this boost level and made this much power. And then we put E85 in, and then we did an injector upgrade, then we did an intercooler, and then step by step where they did all these things so people could see. And then we put a camshaft in, and, you know, we put this short runner intake manifold on. It did this, but it also did this. And we put this down pipe on, a 3-inch down pipe, and it improved the response rate. And it did all. There's not that. There wasn't that for the Z motor. There wasn't that for the, and maybe we need to look at that, the 300ZX, the next version up from the 280ZX. We need to look at that motor also, the 3-liter, and do the same kind of things on that, because I think that all of these motors deserve that. I wish I would have done this 20 years ago. Yeah, and there are dyno tests, and like I said, some of them are just, here's our car, we ran on the dyno. Okay, well the video is of you guys talking, mostly of your feet and the bottom of the car. They never show the engine. They don't show the boost. They don't talk about it. They don't show the turbo. They don't show anything on the engine. They don't show any of the dyno results. It's just guys there at the dyno. And some guy that apparently forgot that his job was like to film that stuff. And it's just, it's frustrating. Adam Carolla, he's a real car guy. A VG30 turbo build, cool. A top fuel Hemi. That's going to be really hard to test. Yeah, it's much better to have individual stuff to know. Even that is not ideal, because the order that you put them in, that you install them in, affects the gains that you get. I mean, we use the example of putting a ported head on before you put the cam on. The ported head shows next to nothing. The cam shows more than it would have if you would have just put the cam in with a stock head. So which one of those is right? Well, the answer is they're all right, because it just depends on the order, and you get to pick that. But you'll get people that pick that apart. Oh yeah, you know, that you're just favoring the results, or you're just making it up, or you're just, I don't know, people yelling about stuff. It's our 12% or whatever. Thank you guys all for showing up. I need to get going, and I will see you guys all tomorrow. Boom.